freedom, justice, and equality is innate to blacks and foreign to whites. Egypt founded at least 7,000 BC, a minimum 6,300 years before Greek civilization. Number one, I have not neglected myself. Number two, I have not stolen. Number three, I have not coveted it. Number four, I have not privileged. Number five, I have not offensively killed people. Number six, I have not underestimated what is needed for goodness to flourish. Number seven, I have not been fraudulent. Number 8, I have not abused nature. Number 9, I have not told lies. Number 10, I have not withheld nourishment. Number 11, I have not been negative to life. Number 12, I have not strayed from morality. Number 13, I have not destroyed what feeds all. Number 14, I have not enslaved nor extorted. Number 15, I have not stolen future insurance. Number 16, I have not eavesdropped. Number 17, I have not talked more than I've listened. Number 18, I have not contended for what is not mine. Number 19, I have not committed adultery. Number 20, I have not been promiscuous. "21. I have not indulged in fear nor other emotions that do not really exist. 22. Have not misled myself nor others away from perfection. 23. I have not indulged in anger. 24. I have not been deaf to truth. 25. I have not caused strife. 26. I have not been complicit with injustice. 27. I have not fetishized sex. 28. I have not opposed Mayat. 29. I have not been argumentative. 30. I have not intimidated. 31. I have not neglected patience. 32. I have not lived a lie. 33. I have not gossiped. "34. I have not encouraged corruption. 35. I have not slandered good leaders. 36. I have not polluted water. 37. I have not been loud of voice. 38. I have not blasphemed our Creator. 39. I have not been arrogant. 40. I have not discriminated the oneness of the Creator creations. 41. I have not lived above my means and put myself in debt. 42. I have not worked against the perfection of my community." Black civilizations held well-established spiritual, humane, environmental, and moral principles at least 6,000 years before any European civilization, and even with that example, not one European nation held any notion of equality. The Greeks, Romans, British, Spaniards, Dutch, American nations, nor the world's three largest religions, Judaism, Islam, or Christian nations have not been able to identify the inhumanity in the institution of slavery. Thousands of years after, blacks made it an eternal sin that blocks you from the afterlife.
Whole cities could be captured and the occupants sold into slavery. The most famous example of this were the Spartan helots. Largely comprised of the people of Messenia, the whole population was defeated in the 7th century BCE and enslaved, creating a large underclass of state-owned slaves who were tied to the land and treated harshly by the Spartans for hundreds of years. The helots in particular were poorly treated. They were ritually humiliated, beaten, and forced to wear dogskin clothing. They were force-fed alcohol until they were horrifically drunk, just to teach Spartan teenagers a lesson about alcohol abuse. Members of the Spartan Crypteia would stalk and kill the strongest of the helots, just to remind them of their place below the Spartiates. Every now and then, the helots would rebel, but their Spartiate masters, who spent their lives training for war, brutally crushed these rebellions, leaving the helots without any chance of escape. It wasn't all rosy for slaves though. They may have been valuable, but this is not the same as respected. They were property, and were at the whim of their owner, who wasn't necessarily benevolent. Slaves could be treated well, a valued part of the household, and they could also be beaten harshly, or even raped with no legal rights or recourse, and no punishment for the perpetrator. Some slaves could be hetairai, sought after, earning gifts and money for themselves and their master. Others could be pornai, used, abused, disrespected, and downtrodden. Masters were expected to look after their slaves, and couldn't just kill a slave at will, but punishments for doing so were not as harsh as if they'd killed a citizen. Killing another man's slave, though, was a real legal problem. You were liable to pay fines and could be forced to compensate the owner. You had destroyed his property after all. The worst life for slaves, though, was to work in the mines. This was harsh, dangerous work with long shifts and cramped conditions, hardly seeing daylight. The Athenian mines at Laurium were estimated to have been worked by up to 30,000 slaves, some of whom were children. We can tell because archaeologists have discovered their bodies in collapsed mine shafts. What were ancient Greek attitudes towards slavery? What stands out is that for all the incredible flowering of Greek thought, all their notions of freedom and virtue, slavery went largely unquestioned. Even the greatest thinkers of the time, possibly of all time, who were known for questioning deeply held attitudes and beliefs, had a rather large blind spot towards slavery. Aristotle thought that some people were naturally slaves. They simply weren't born with the skills and intelligence needed to be free. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. And Aristotle wasn't alone. For most Greeks, slaves are seen like labour-saving machines, or at best, like a loved family pet. What's remarkable is that even the slaves themselves often agreed, accepting their lot in life, helping prop up the institution of slavery in which they were trapped. Freed slaves would often go on to buy their own slaves, and while some escaped from cruel masters, many clearly had great love for them. Slaves were often so loyal that in Athenian courts, their evidence was considered inadmissible unless they were tortured first, lest they'd lie to protect their master. Slaves, owners, traders, politicians, philosophers and farmers, all were part of a system that relied on slavery being taken for granted. None could imagine that slavery might be wrong because it seemed so natural to them.
Slave labor was a huge aspect of Roman life, and the Republic depended heavily on free work from human beings who had no rights, no possessions, and were left at the whims of their masters to be worked to death, starved, tortured, and sometimes even killed for the sake of enjoyment. Sure, you may have seen Russell Crowe play one in a movie, but chances are you have no idea just how brutal it really was. Slaves in ancient Rome didn't just work as domestic or agricultural workers. They did pretty much every single kind of menial job you can imagine. Generally classified as urban or rural, slaves did everything from cooking and cleaning to mining for silver. On country estates, slaves might perform both domestic and non-domestic tasks, even working as smiths, bakers, and guards. Occasionally, urban slaves would work as accountants and managers for businessmen. If you were a slave that originated as a prisoner of war, you might have been sold off to the public and could have been tasked with fighting fires, tending to public buildings, and even working as an executioner. Some under the age of 30 and wanted to buy your way out of servitude, you were completely out of luck. According to the Roman jurist Gaius, slaves under the age of 30 could not be freed during the 1st century CE. Being a slave was cruel and unbearable during any time period, and the Roman slaves were no exception. Slaves who were considered property of the masters were expected to behave, and if they didn't, the consequences were nightmare fuel. In Maniacomi by Plautus, the 2nd century playwright attributes the following words to Messenia, a slave.